So, hi everyone, welcome. Welcome to the History Project. Tonight we're doing an oral history live with a roundtable from Fag Rag. My name is Matisse Dupont. I'm the Director of Engagement and Advancement for the History Project, and I'm just so excited for tonight. This is really, really fun. So, in case anyone happens to be new to the History Project in particular, well, welcome. We are Boston's queer community archives. We are dedicated to documenting, preserving, and sharing Boston's queer history. So, if you're interested in LGBTQ plus history at all, please keep in touch with us. I'm just going to put in the chat now a link to our Instagram. Here's a link to our link tree where you can sign up for all of our events. I'm just popping some links into the chat for everyone. I also just want to quickly say that we are a grant and community funded nonprofit. If you at all are interested in helping us with our mission of preserving, documenting, and sharing queer Boston history, you can help us in a few ways. Really importantly, you can read everything that we put out, interact, engage with us, share whenever you get our newsletters. If you're not subscribed, you should subscribe. You can also share it with your friends, read it, engage, things like that. Come to our events just like this. And then also, since we are funded by grants and also the community, anything you can do to help us support our mission. You can donate here, but also you can come to events and donate that way like you have tonight. So thank you everyone who has already. So with all the plugs and the all that aside, let's get started on tonight, okay? I'm going to read us the bio of Fag Rag that our very own Michael Bronski here has written. Fag Rag was the first of several national gay male cultural and political publications to emerge after Stonewall Uprising of June 1969. Growing out of Boston's Lavender Vision, a 1970 lesbian and gay male newspaper, Fag Rag published its first issue in June 1971 and its last in 1987. Over those 16 years, it produced 44 issues. Run by an ever-changing collective operating on anarchist principles of leftist gay men, its linchpin was Charlie Shively, whose enormous dedication kept everything running. Fag Rag's content was eclectic. The content was eclectic: poetry, photography, fiction, plays, drawing, collages, memoirs, essays, and political analysis, and what some call now theory. Its graphic design was post-data, pre-punk, anarchic, and for many, it was disorienting and even shocking sometimes. Also, shout out to Charlie Shively. I'm wearing overalls. He was never spotted without them, so I wore some in honor of Charlie. Fag Rag was always at the forefront of radical queer social and political thought. It was often rude, shocking, combative, anti-authoritarian, explicitly sexual, and boundary pushing. Every issue was a debate, often between members of the collective itself. Inevitably, it changed how gay men thought about their lives, influencing both the movement and the world. Over the years, various collectives emerged from Fag Rag, founding the Boston Gay Review, Fag Rag Books, and Good Gay Poets Press, which published some of the most important works of contemporary queer poets. So once again, thank you all so much for being here for this Oral History Live with this roundtable with Fag Rag. Let me introduce to you our host for this evening, Mark Crone, who is a long-time volunteer for the History Project for 20 years. Mark, take it away.
Thank you, Matisse. And I first want to apologize or perhaps welcome you to my seance. The lighting in my apartment not is not optimal, but I am so happy to welcome on behalf of the History Project, Michael Bronsky, Mark Heumann, Kevin McGurr, Shannon, and Maya Silverthorne, who all worked on Fag Rag and were and are pioneering activists. They will introduce themselves in a moment. But I just want to thank them all for being here. And I want to also acknowledge those people who are viewing us who also had a role in Fag Rag. I'm sure we have some people viewing, and perhaps you'll have a question later. There are many people who are no longer with us who worked on Fag Rag, and we remember them tonight. Among them are two foundational people, Charles Shively and John Mitzel. And I want to read how Charlie Shively introduced Fag Rag when he was asked, what is this publication? And first, I'll just say that Charlie he came to Boston to attend Harvard in 1955. He was a writer, a poet, an activist, and a longtime professor at Boston State College, which is now UMass Boston. Writing for Slate, Jim Downs said, Shively was an activist on the scale, if not the name recognition, of Harvey Milk. Charles Shively died in 2017. When asked to describe Fag Rag, he said, it was sexual liberation, anarchism, hippie love, drugs, peace, Maoism, Marxism, rock and roll, folk songs, cultural separatism, feminism, effeminism, tofu with brown rice, communal living, urban junkies, rural purists, nudists, leather, high camp, gender fuck drag, essays, and pictures. Also from Ohio was John Mitchell. He came to Boston in 1965 to attend college. He was a prolific writer, activist, and a sparkling conversationalist. Mitchell managed Glad Day Bookshop, a gay bookstore, the South End, the South Station Cinema, and I believe the North Station Cinema as well. And in 2000, he opened his own gay bookstore, Calamus, which he ran until his death in 2013. Mitchell and Shively were there from the very first issue to the very last. And this is how Mitchell described the beginning of Fag Rag, and I quote him now. We all met at a meeting in 1970 or 71. There were various gay groups on campuses then, and they decided to merge them all for a Friday night function at the Sherman Union at BU, where I was attending. It was a wonderful mix of people. It was the beginning of the 70s. A little flower power, a little nitty gritty. I met Charlie Shively that night. We decided we had to have a newspaper. A bunch of the gay boys and some of the women decided to create one, and we called it Lavender Vision. There was just one issue, and the women decided they wanted their own paper. I think they put out another issue also called Lavender Vision. So we went ahead and published our paper, Fag Rag, in 71. It came out quarterly for 10 years and then fell off schedule, but it didn't matter. Let's begin by having our panel introduce themselves. Two people who were there at the very first issue with John Mitchell and Charlie Shively were Mark Human and Kevin McGurr. Mark, would you like to start us off?
Sure. A little bit about myself. I come from a middle-class family in Queens, New York. My parents were both refugees from the Holocaust, and I came to school in Northeastern in 1965. I immediately started a radical paper at Northeastern and joined Students for a Democratic Society, which was big thing at the time. But I started discovering my sexuality at that point, and I never told anyone about it. So I was living like two different lives. One, a radical person, the other, this gay boy that went to gay bars at night. And when Stonewall happened, it seemed somewhat liberating to me. I told some of my friends, but again, I was mainly in the closet. And then in 1970, I had graduated. I lived in a communal situation, and I started hearing about gay liberation, that there were people in gay liberation, and there, in fact, was a house of people somewhere in Cambridge. And we got together, had consciousness raising groups, and as someone just mentioned, we had put together Lavender Vision, at least the first edition, and it was back to back. One side was men, one side was women. And then I found this group of people in this house, and we took off from there. So more to that, and I fell in love with one of the panelists here. So that's my bio.
Thank you. Thank you. Kevin.
Well, like Mark, I also grew up in New York City, not in not from a Holocaust background. I went to college in upstate New York, and after college moved to Boston with a girlfriend essentially, and then struggled with my coming out. And of course, I got very involved with consciousness raising groups and with what was then called GLF, Gay Liberation Front, which then later became Gay Male Liberation when the boys and girls separated. And we got involved with the first couple of issues. I got involved with the first couple of issues of Fag Rag. It's just interesting. You'll hear a lot about the history and some of the changes, the many changes that happened over the life of the newspaper. Uh, and I'll talk a little bit later about the early beginnings. My life took a different turn. I became more of a moving away from activism and becoming more of a mental health provider, and did some of that. I was on the board of the early Fenway Community Health Center, where we actually founded the first, mental health services as part of that larger community clinic. I also worked at what was then called the Homophile Community Health Services, which was then on Boylston Street, and that was somewhere in I guess, the mid 70s. And then moved myself back to San Francisco. I had a propensity to move back and forth, and where I became involved with another LGBT plus AQ agency in San Francisco known as Operation Concern. I was there for about 10 years, and the last number of years I was the executive director. So that's a kind of a brief summary of who I am.
Thank you, Kevin. Michael Bronsky.
Hi, I've actually not a whole lot to say. I was out before Stonewall. I joined Gay Liberation Front in New York in June of '69. We started a chapter on my college campus in Newark. I moved to Boston in '71 and began going to Fag Rag meetings in like end of '71, '72, and became involved. I probably worked on issues 3 to 7 or 9 or so, but I was always involved. I was involved with Good Gay Poets and with Boston Gay Review as well. I was working as a chef or as a cook in different places at a bathhouse for a while. But really, Fag Rag was a sort of where my entire energy was sort of focused. And I probably spoke to Charlie and John mostly every day since '73 until they died. And since then I got invited to teach at Dartmouth and then at Harvard. So now I'm teaching Fag Rag to 18-year-olds at Harvard.
Thank you, Michael. Shannon. Oh, I think you're muted. You're muted. There you go.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Great.
Hi, I'm Shannon. I was born in Boston. I grew up in the inner city, in the projects in the inner city in Boston. I started going downtown to explore what I didn't know at the time was the gay world, mostly centered around Park Square, the Combat Zone, the block on Com Ave, and Boylston Street. And in 1974, I was 16 years old. I was sort of bumming around downtown and came upon what I thought was an anti-war march. It looked just like all the anti-war marches that happened throughout my life. I watched for a while, looked at the signs, and I realized I learned it was a gay liberation march. The following summer, 1975, I actually looked in the Boston Phoenix to find out when this parade was going to happen, and I went to it. It was a goal to go to this parade. At that rally, I met some of the people from Fag Rag. I had grown up in a radical home. My mom was a leftist. My mom was an activist. And the people in Fag Rag sort of fit that same mold. I felt very much at home with them. In 1976, I came out. The Fag Rag people was some of the people I gravitated to at that time. I That year, I worked on the Gay Pride Planning Committee. Ended up leaving Boston for a few years. Came back in 1978 and sort of just jumped right in with the Fag Rag Collective at that time. That was almost 50 years ago. A lot has happened between now and then, and now I am a single dad in Brooklyn.
Thank you, Shannon. Maya Silverthorne.
Yeah, hi, my name is,
You are muted. Thank you.
yeah, hi, I'm Maya. That's my taken name. My given name is Mark Matheson. I was born in Chicago to a pretty upper class family. I went through, torture in high school. I sort of knew about homosexuality since I was 11, and kept going in and out of denial with it. And 3 days after my 18th birthday at Cornell, I went to the Gay Liberation Center. And I stood in the doorway shaking, and three people sort of immediately saw what it was and sat me down and started talking about college and classes and anything but being gay. And by the end of the night, I'd met someone and had wild sex, and I was completely radicalized. And I took the name Maya Silverthorne because I felt such a completely different person from who I had been before. And Maya was sort of a feminized name, and Silverthorne was my mother's maiden name. I met Shannon in San Francisco, and we went to Minneapolis for, I don't know, maybe 8 months. And we helped start what I think is the first gay radio program, Fresh Fruit. And then I came with him to Boston and immediately got caught up in Fag Rag. And it was sort of my life until about 1983. I got a nursing degree. And that and the beginning of the AIDS movement sort of moved me away from it all. But I never lost touch with Charlie and some other people.
That's great. Thank you, Maya. And we can start the discussion, maybe go back to Mark and Kevin, who were there at the very first issue. Can you describe, Fag Rag didn't just happen out of nowhere. It came from a certain atmosphere and ferment in the city of Boston and Cambridge and that time and place. And please, other people, Michael, whoever wants to chime in. But can you talk about the atmosphere at the time, politically, socially, sexually?
Yeah, this was a revolution going on. It was really a strong revolution. It was finally gay people had something to say. The atmosphere in Boston was good, but it centered around a house in Cambridge where gay men lived together, where we went every weekend for dancing, consciousness raising. It was really a very radical time. We had talked about a newspaper, and there were so many things going on at the time. It's hard to even say when we started talking about it, how it got delivered, how we put it together, and it was just quite a time. There was a lot of things going on. I even remember where we, at one point, thought we needed to radicalize more people, that we actually brought coffee and donuts to the male sex workers in the block in Boston, hoping to radicalize them. Didn't really work, as far as I know, but that was the atmosphere we lived in. Other things that were happening, we would go to anti-war demonstrations as a gay group, which was really amazing. We went to a demonstration in Washington in May of 1971, where we met gay people from all over the country. It was an anti-war demonstration, and we were all there as gay, which was at least new to me, and I think new to everyone else. And we had to educate some of the straight people that were at the demonstration, but we did.
Kevin?
jump in.
Yeah, I think Mark has it right. I mean, I think the context, it's interesting to think about how the larger community must have thought about these young, oftentimes androgynous looking, in today's language, non-binary, with long hair, looking a little raggedy, and certainly not the idea of what later was often referred to as the gym bunnies or the Castro clones, which oftentimes is a reference here in San Francisco. It was very much kind of on the left, and we were not interested at that particular time in legal rights or anti-discrimination per se. It was very much a kind of looking inward and being very aware of our psychological and social relationship. We were again not fighting the law. We were the enemies at that point were religion and psychiatry. That they were the enemy. They were the ones that had defined us. And I think we can make the case that in terms of that historical evolution, that was important to really look at those underpinnings of what defined homosexuality. We were very aligned with, other quote leftist causes, women, African Americans. Of course, the war was going on, civil rights. And I think what also began to happen, I think for a lot of us, I know for me, that we began to define, oh, well, we're oppressed too. We're marginalized also. We've got a story to tell, and it's important that we are advocating for ourselves. And I think that was, a very important part of the context of what was going on at that point. Uh, we also, I look back at the first couple of issues that I was involved with. The other piece is that, there was no such thing as intellectual property. There's no bylines. I can't even remember which articles I wrote in those first couple of issues because there's no names connected to who wrote what. And I think that was all part of the spirit at that time, that we were collective. We were doing this together. Um, and again, we were perhaps, the seeds of transgenderism. I mean, not to say that what's happening now is obviously very, very important, but we were sensitive to the issues of kind of like the binary and a kind of gender fuck and sexual and gender transgression, was very much of what we were interested in. We were very much in your face. I mean, I think that's very much, even the name itself is clearly in your face. And, we've had discussion about who came up with the name. I say I came up with the name. Mark says he came up with the name. Mitchell said he came up with the name. Well, who knows?
We hear there's 42 people came up with the name.
And again, but it was clearly for me, no one ever called me queer. I grew up in a housing project in New York City. No one ever called me queer. Fag maybe, that was a much more hurtful and intense kind of insult. So we took that word and we turned it around. We were going to use that. And I know the paper, and again, you can read letters in the later issues that people were very unhappy, with the term fag rag. But again, we stuck with it because again, we were trying to neutralize and take from the enemy, how they were defining us. And again, I think you'll hear from other people talking, the early issues they were very rough. They were not necessarily well edited. They were not polished. And again, I think that was, again, part of the spirit of what was going on in those first couple of issues. And the final point that I'll make is that it was important to us to be public, to basically communicate to the world, we're here, we deserve to be seen, we deserve to be heard. And we perceived that we were doing that by getting the word out through, the pen as opposed to the sword.
I'd like also to mention that a lot of it came from the women's movement. Women had taken over a building in Harvard. We learned from that. So I think that's an important point to talk about the time.
And that started the Women's Center in Cambridge, which
Yes.
still goes on to this day, and was, I believe, the first women's center. And they took over a Harvard-owned building and would not leave until their demands were met. Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I would just like to chime in and say that I think you can't really, you can't underestimate the effect of the Vietnam War, also called the War Against Vietnam, more accurately. Because everybody in Fag Rag, everybody we knew, everybody in college, all men, could be drafted, and many were drafted, and many tried to get out of the draft. I mean, I actually was not drafted because I said I was a homosexual and couldn't lie to my government, and they actually believed me, which is true. But I think that the impending notion of fighting against this war, mixed with, you know, watching the Black Panthers be so assertive, and none of us were going to be Black Panthers ever in their tactics, right? And to go back to what Mark said, right, that the influence of feminism with consciousness raising, with small meetings of people sharing feelings, really was the beginning of the gay liberation movement, and certainly of Fag Rag, and certainly coming out of Boston, which has such a strong feminist influence in terms of national feminism. So I think that you can't. Fag Rag didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of an extremely hot crucible of social events and of important historical moments.
I think that's really important, Michael, because as someone who was growing up in Boston in the 60s and 70s, the universities and the housing project I grew up in was right down the street from State Teachers College, Harvard Medical School, and Harvard School of Public Health. And State Teachers College, which became Boston State, had weekly building takeovers. There were always anti-war demonstrations there. In the projects, as, during the Great Migration and after the Great Migration, the Black Panthers had a very strong presence in that part of Boston, very near the universities, and there was a lot of back and forth between the students at the school and the Panthers and the projects. And the projects that I grew up in were all single mothers, and there were no dads in the projects. And I think that's probably still mostly true today. When you go look at housing projects today, I don't think there's a lot of dads there. It's a lot of single moms. And the early feminist movement was very much in play for women like my mother, who was a young Irish Catholic girl with 4 kids and no income. And coming from that, when I encountered the people at Fag Rag, when I encountered gay liberation in Boston, it was all that same sort of zeitgeist, that radicalism. And it felt very much like gay liberation was part of feminism, anti-war, Black liberation, that it was all, that Boston was this hotbed of radicalism. And I think that was probably quite a petri dish for something like Fag Rag to grow from.
Can we, before we move on, that's so interesting. Can we just go around, because we talked in our preliminary session that Boston was also a training ground, and is, for activists that went on around the country. If you look at the organizations that exist in the U.S. Over the years, many of the people started out in Boston at organizations like Fag Rag and other places. Can you just tell everybody where you're talking to us from tonight? Maya?
I live in Santa Fe. I'm in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. I left Boston in about 88. And I just, when we talk about Boston as the petri dish, I think nationally too, people need to know that all of those movements were like coming up at the same time. And I mean, it's ecology and zero growth. And, you know, and I was a teenager and I grew my hair long. And my grandmother came to me and said, well, if you grow your hair long, this is what's going to happen to you. And she slapped a Newsweek magazine that said gay liberation down on it. And so that's the first I heard of it and started to move to it. But I mean, that was the whole zeitgeist of the country, was one movement after another.
Mark, where are you talking to us from?
I'm in Watertown, so right outside of
Excellent.
Boston. Um,
Thank you for visiting. And Michael, you are in Cambridge?
I am in Cambridge. I've lived in Cambridge since '73.
Okay.
I've lived in two different places, an apartment, and now I own a home. So I haven't moved far from
And
anywhere.
Shannon, where are you
Oh,
from tonight?
I am in Brooklyn, New York. I've been
Right,
in
you said.
Brooklyn for 21 years. I left Boston to go to New York in 1997, started in Manhattan, and then came to Brooklyn.
Okay, because Boston was not expensive enough for you.
Exactly.
Kevin, where are
exactly.
you coming from tonight? Kevin,
I'm in the gay capital, San Francisco,
excellent.
and
Okay.
I've been here primarily since '83, although
Wow.
I've been back and forth a couple of times, but mostly here since '83.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just, Mark, I think the other really important thing, now that we're talking about real estate, to keep in mind in the '70s, at the '60s and '70s, right, is Fag Rag and all those other groups, all those other papers could not have existed without rent control. That we
It's
could live in a
true.
group. I mean, my first apartment on Putnam Avenue, there were three of us, including Louis Landerson, who was involved with Fag Rag and who actually lived with Kevin and Mark when you were on Dimmick Street.
Yep.
And we paid $145 a month. And
Mm.
some months we could barely make the rent, right? So if cheap housing meant that we could have part-time jobs, which meant that we could spend 75% of our time working on political things
hmm
or going out cruising, but we didn't have to have full-time jobs to pay the rent.
But
And
I think that was
that just couldn't happen now.
I think that was probably true in Boston until the early 80s.
Yeah, yeah. And Cambridge and Boston and Somerville all had rent control, and Brookline all had rent control.
hmm
Yeah, I think, I mean, to your point, Michael, most of the people, and I look back at the names on the masthead for at least the first edition, and I remember most of those people, and of course, they were largely in their 20s, and Charlie, of course, seemed like he was an older man at that point, although he was probably just in his 30s, but he was established. He had a job, he had a home.
137.
Right, right. He had a car, so, and I am assuming that it was Charlie who essentially, bankrolled, the first issue. I don't remember how, we I guess I do recall hawking the paper in Harvard Square for 10 cents. And I'm sure that didn't come anywhere near covering the cost, although I'm sure printing costs were much, much less than they are now.
I think talking about neighborhoods, when I came, I lived on Fort Hill. And Fort Hill, before I had gotten there, was a set of, I don't know the whole story, but the set of houses called Fort Hill Faggots for Freedom.
Right.
And people started buying them individually. And I rented a bottom floor apartment for $100. And I had to run through two projects to get to work and go anyplace. So Charlie's car was very helpful to me.
$100, and we couldn't afford that.
And so many people lived in Fort Hill, and they wound up working with Fag Rag and moving in and out.
Yeah, I think Maya, you make a really good point there, and we haven't really talked about Fort Hill. In the late 60s, there was a group of radical queens called the Roxbury Jamaica Plain Queens for Action. And they became the Fort Hill Faggots for Freedom sometime in the early 70s. I found them in 1976. I started dating a guy who lived in Fort Hill, and it was very much, I think at that time there were 6 houses, so there were probably 30 or 35 faggots living there in 76, and everyone in some way, shape, or form was involved in radical gay politics, whether they were with Fag Rag or GCN, or they were just always showing up at organizing meetings for demonstrations. And I don't think that the history of the Fort Hill Faggots has been told yet. And if it has, I haven't found it. But they were it was a really important community and an instrumental group of people in radical gay politics in the 70s.
Can I ask Michael is he representing what I think of as the middle period. Although he, as he pointed out, he was really involved right much to the end. But you definitely, not having been involved in the very beginning, were close to the beginning.
Yeah.
How did you see things changing? How would you characterize, issues 3 through whatever it was, and how is it different?
Well, many of the earlier people, you and Mark, had moved out to San Francisco or moved out to other places or
Yep.
moved on, right? My memory is that the collective kept changing over time, right? We were sort of finding a voice. I remember we laid out I want to say issue 3, it's probably issue 4 at the Indochina Peace Campaign office basement. So we were really connected with the anti-war movement. That was on Brookline Street, right next to what was it called? Teddy the Bear? TT the Bears.
The bear, TT the bear.
Bears.
Yeah. TT the Bear. And I think as more people got involved, there were more tensions as well, right? I remember people can look through the issues, but John Mitzel and Steve Abbott did an article on Gore Vidal. And Charlie wrote a piece protesting the article in the same issue, saying Gore Vidal doesn't need our attention. And there were other people who were, somebody did an interview with a person close to W.H. Auden. And again, there was a lot of discussion that, essentially we aren't a literary magazine, we're a political magazine. We really don't want to spend time talking about famous queer people who get more than enough attention in the partisan review. So it really was
what
a
did
lot
you
of,
write about? What were the articles that people did write about?
People wrote about, well, Charlie famously wrote his 16-part cocksucking as an act of revolution articles.
Yep.
The early issues, and it continued up until issue 10, or even beyond, about gay men in prisons. I mean, I think it's important to actually realize that the gay liberation movement was very concerned about the carceral state, and we had prisoner projects that happened that happened at Fag Rag, and then it moved over to GCN because of Mike Riegel. Early issues of Gay Sunshine had lots of articles about prisoners. People wrote about coming out. People wrote about personal things. We published I don't know what word I want. Huge amount of poetry. Often very good, often not very good. I mean, I can remember people, and I'm sure this is true of maybe not the early issues, but certainly for Shannon and Maya, right? We would get envelopes of people writing poetry and saying, I can't keep this at home. Can you print it? And if you don't want to print it, can you just share it? Right? People from small towns across America, right? People sending in essentially sort of erotic or porno pictures that they had drawn that they couldn't keep at home. We were somewhat Marxist. People wrote articles about Marxism. It's really a grab bag.
I think the poetry was in many ways how people came out. So they wrote all this emotional poetry, and I was a snob because I thought, well, I've never read poetry. This is the only poem they ever wrote. But we got so many. There were so many people, and I think they were just trying to find a way to express new emotions that they stuffed in for so long.
And I think that points to something that Michael brought up earlier when there was Charlie's objection to Gore Vidal, and there was sort of an anti-star, anti-fame feeling around Fag Rag. This was a publication of the people.
Yep.
And I think that the way we embraced poetry, the way we embraced prisoners, the way we embraced Marxism and radical politics was in such opposition to the idea that we needed to celebrate gay superstars. There wasn't really room for us. There wasn't really room in Fag Rag for a lot of stardom.
I think there was also a tendency, and this was a tension. I think it was a tension in many other places, particularly in papers coming out of New York, right? That people, and I think John Mitzel is one of these people, right? Viewed Fag Rag as incredibly important and really a voice of the people, but it might be a place to move on to other publications too, right? I know John was always mailing out manuscripts to other places. You know, and if you look at the New York Native, many of those people moved on to become quite notable authors like Ed White and Andrew Holleran. But there was always a tension of some people, I think, thinking of Fag Rag as a launching pad.
Yeah. And I think you're
Which is not bad,
highlighting,
but
yeah.
I wanted to go back
to
to the
its reason.
first issue because we were very worried that we would be seen as elitist. And there was looking at the article right now, there was an open letter to gay brothers saying that we are not totally liberated yet, but we're working towards liberation and we wanted people to join us. And that was very important at the time. You know, but I'd have that.
Yeah, Mark, when we were talking last week about this event, we were talking about how the culture changed from between 1971 and 1981, or really between 1971 and 1978, where when in the early and mid 70s, what we were talking about was gay liberation. We wanted to get the psychiatrists off our back, get the police off our back, get the church off our back. We wanted to be able to hold jobs. We wanted to be able to walk down the street safely, which as late as 1977, 1978 was really not true. I mean, the psychiatrists had backed off, but there was still a lot in the 70s. There was still a lot of violence towards gay people. And the idea that we would have and put any of our energy into pursuing gay rights just seemed like a waste of time. We were just trying to raise people's consciousness and carve out a place to be safe in the world. And I think Fag Rag very much represented that sort of old revolutionary guard of gay liberation. And as we moved into the 80s, sort of the gay community culture had changed dramatically and was no longer really radical, and we were sort of dinosaurs.
I just want to remind everybody to please, if you have questions, put them in, and we are going to start answering them soon. Is there anything anybody wants to add? These are wonderful questions that are coming in, so I'm kind of dying to ask a couple of them, but.
Yeah, I just want to agree with Shannon that a question I'm teaching a class on 60s radical politics now. And the first class I posed the question, I've talked about these being moved, it's called power to the people. So, and my question is, do you want power or do you want rights? And of course you should have both. But what does each one do, right? And I think Fag Rag is a prime example of people seizing power, as were the Black Panthers, as were the radical feminists and Shulamith Firestone and other people, right? And there's nothing, there's nothing wrong with an anti-discrimination law, but it's different than actually claiming rights within the culture. I mean, claiming power within the culture.
Yeah, and I think, part of it is, we were, again, in this theme, more interested in, our identities and our visibility. I think visibility is an important component. I looked back again, one of the first issues, there was a demonstration at Ken's. I guess Ken's doesn't exist anymore, in Copley Square, where, gay men showed up and, basically were protesting that someone had gotten thrown out. So it was kind of like, again, that visibility issue was much more foundational and fundamental as compared to whether or not we were being discriminated against jobs, or whether we had the right to marry, or whether we had the right to be in the military. Those things we were not thinking about at all. I mean, it was very much a very personal, looking inward, how do I feel about myself? And I think, when Mark mentioned earlier in the kind of the alliance with feminism, there was a very strong kind of affinity with women. As gay men, we were identifying and we definitely felt a lot of those same kinds of issues. That was much more important. And I think, for me, when I look back, at some of the history Michael used the word tensions. I think there was a lot of tensions. Gay men at some point decided, well, wait a minute, I can be masculine too. It's not all about being, gender fuck and looking, like some non-binary person. I think that those tensions were being worked out, very early on and probably, transpired over the course of Fag Rag being published.
Yeah. And I think, early issues, I think issue 5 or 6, we had articles, I think John Mitchell may have written one about sadomasochism. And there were people who were writing, and Alan Young wrote a letter, and I believe protesting the article. I think we were as a community really finding ourselves and really finding this sort of plethora of identities that we could have, and that in fact we could try on.
Yep.
And isn't that really at the root of
radicalism?
radicalism? Isn't that really at the root of radicalism, the ability and the willingness to talk about these topics that were still so taboo at the time, and actually uncomfortable topics amongst ourselves?
Mhm.
Speaking of discomfort, how many people of color were involved?
That's
a question we've got.
I can only remember one.
As it evolved, not as many as should have been, but far more than almost any other magazine that I could think of at the time. Thomas Dutton, Larry Anderson, we published
Ken Dudley,
Ken Dudley, Christian Walker,
Chua
Black and Queer. Yeah, I'm sorry, Shannon.
Chua Xuan what?
Yeah.
Chua.
I kind of want to shout out to him because he was one of my very dearest friends, and he basically came out at Glad Day Bookstore talking to someone, and he was a PhD student at MIT, and he was Chinese Malaysian, and he became Marxist because he was so alienated by the white culture around him. And he started talking at Glad Day Books, and someone said, well, you're pretty radical, come here, and led him into Fag Rag.
Yeah.
And he went on to start, I think, probably not the first, but one of the very earliest Asian gay support groups. It was lesbian and gay, and he wound up counseling people in Hong Kong and Taiwan on how to set their own groups. So this is sort of how things would spread out from Fag Rag.
But I think to your question, Mark, I think it has to be said, it was very much overwhelmingly a, white, maybe not necessarily coming from a middle or upper middle class background, but very much an educated background to people who were, early on and all the way through. So in that sense, there were clearly a lot of, structural, systematic, personages, in that effort.
As has been said earlier, Boston is a school with a city with a primary industry is education. And religion, but education is just like a major industry there. And many of the people who formed the anti-war movement in Boston, the feminist movement in Boston, even the Black Panther movement in Boston, as well as the gay liberation movement in Boston, were people who were there for school. So that you're already talking about people who are at a certain economic class that many Black people in Boston did not enjoy.
Can I ask a basic question that people might be wondering about, because I certainly did, which is, as a collective, nobody's saying, hey, I think I'm in charge, you need to write about this. And I want articles on this, this, and this, and I want them on time and all that. How did you figure out who was going to write what, and how did you get the issues to bookstores around Boston and around the country?
So can I just interrupt? On time had no meaning in fact. And it literally would not compute.
And I don't think anybody was ever asked to write anything.
Right.
People
Correct.
just wrote stuff and we looked at it. The meetings were wild. We just read through everything and discussed it all. And
so the meetings were when you read through all this stuff.
Yeah, we would show up in the back office behind GCN on Bromfield Street. At least this was from the mid 70s on. GCN was in the front part of the building. We were in the back room, and we would show up. I believe it was Tuesday evenings, and Charlie would show up with a mail bag, all the stuff that had come in from the to the post office box, and we would sit there and we'd open it one at a time. And if it was a manuscript for an article, someone would take it to read it that week, and if it was a stack of poems, someone would take that to read. And the next week we'd talk about those, and then open the next week's mail. And it was just sort of like an organic process of just wading through all this stuff and talking about it. And we laughed a lot, and we had very serious conversations about topics that were, you know, hot topics at the time. And a lot of it, Michael mentioned the Gore Vidal thing. We would get articles that were about pop culture or about famous people or from famous people.
Yeah.
And that was always a conversation we would have. That would always be a debate.
Yeah. So I'm curious, Mark and Kevin, for the first two issues, was it like that or was it different?
No, whoever could write, we would publish.
Right.
That was my memory too. I mean, I don't recall that
Yeah.
there was no such thing as spell check or grammar check at a particular point. I'm not even sure. It'd be interesting to go back and look to see if how much editing someone might do at this point at those early issues.
And
And
what
we,
was, sorry, go ahead.
we used the Red Bookstore as where we met all the time and where we put the paper together, at least the first two.
And you sent it to the printer, and that's how it got assembled.
Yeah, there was I think it was something called Free Press. I don't remember the first part of the name that printed it for us.
And what was the relationship between Gay Community News, which, if people are not familiar, began in Boston in 1973, became a very important publication with a national reach. So this is where I think Michael Bronsky, I could be wrong, said Boston was the brains of the gay rights movement in America because it spawned these publications. Yeah. It may not be you, but so in any case, and where San Francisco might have been the body and New York was the protest and whatever. So who wants to talk about the relation between those two publications, if there wasn't?
I mean, I wrote a number of I wrote at different times for GCN. I was not a major contributor, and I think it was I did some news. It was more newsy than what I had done when I was in Fag Rag. And I saw it as, for me, and I'm sure there must be people, in the chat who remember, but I do recall there was a lot of focus for a period of time on Susan Sachs.
Mhm.
Had been, I can remember that she robbed a bank and she was,
Mhm.
again, it was, I think there was a lot of overlap in that it was in some ways a very parochial audience, for some people probably didn't feel that Fag Rag spoke to them because it was just a bunch of hippies, writing these things, and GCN was just a bunch of leftists writing on also very sort of parochial kinds of pieces. So I think that for me, I saw some overlap between the two.
Yeah. And certainly I wrote for both. Well, I wrote very little for Fag Rag, but I was involved in like many ways with the production. But I wrote for GCN. Mike Riegel, who was a main Fag Rag person, worked as the office manager for Gay Community News and ran the Prisoner Project for them. John Kuiper was involved with both. And certainly almost everybody in Gay Community News looked at Fag Rag or read Fag Rag or had an opinion of it. So they were really intertwined, right?
Yeah, and when I got involved with Fag Rag, and I was a leftist, I'd been raised a leftist, and I had a rather elitist idea about what news was, and I didn't think that news had anything to do with being queer. So I sort of had this very sort of highbrow look down upon newspapers. But my friends worked at GCN. I mean, we were all part of the same community.
Yeah.
And there was very much a lot of back and forth among the two groups. You asked earlier about how we got the newspaper, how we got not the newspaper, how we got Fag Rag distributed. And I don't know much about pre-1976, but in 1976, I remember getting in a van with Michael Bumblebee and driving to New Jersey to pick up the printed copies and bring them back. And at that point, it had become harder and harder for us to find printers. And it was a real challenge, especially into the 80s. In the mid 80s, it was, you know, the printers wanted to behave like publishers, and they wanted to have, they had opinions about what we were printing, and that was very difficult for us. And Charlie and Mitzel managed those relationships brilliantly, but it became harder and harder just to get it printed. When Meyer and I returned to Boston in the late 70s, we would get in Charlie's car. We'd load it up with fag rags, and we would drive down the East Coast, stopping at gay bookstores in any city, sometimes stopping at universities to drop off shipments that would be sold. We'd collect a certain amount of money. It was really, we were sort of like a traveling queer show, you know, and sometimes there'd be readings, sometimes there'd be parties. But it was very much, you know, a sneaker network. I noticed in the chat that one of us, it may have been Matisse, asked if we didn't have computers, how did we lay it out? And I want to say we had a light table and we had boards that we sent off the typed pages to a typesetter who sent us back typeset columns, and we had hot wax and we laid them down. You had graphs to make sure it was lined up, and it was a completely analog process. There were no computers.
We had X-Acto knives too, taking letters out to correct,
Yep.
you know, certain typos and things like that. And I was telling stories, you know, last time about how we left certain typos in because we thought.
What's that story, Maya? It was a religious reference that got by us, and there was a typo.
Well, we occasionally made rules about automatically excluding certain topics so that we could get the poems down to a manageable level. And at this point, the two were comparing cocksucking to eating an ice cream cone. And anyone who did that, it was gone. And then the other line, and I don't know why, it might be angry young Catholics, but it was raping the Virgin Mary. And so there was a point where we found this wonderful poem and we really liked it and we sent it off. And then we reread it. And the third line had something about, the third line to the end had something about raping the Virgin Mary. And we didn't really know what to do, but the typeset came back and there were two P's. And so we decided we could keep rapping the Virgin Mary, and that would be, we could all handle that.
All right. I've been told it's time for me to ask some questions. I realize I didn't introduce myself. I'm Jonah Lacqua. I'm the executive director of the History Project. And before I ask questions, I just want to say thank you all so much. This has been amazing. I think I'm speaking for the entire audience. It's just been a delightful conversation. Hopefully the questions continue that and I'm not, messing up the groove. But there's a question from Matt Macho asking about they're curious what the panelists might think Mitzel and Charlie Shively might say if they had lived for this discussion now.
Oh, well, Charlie would not have done it, right? Am I correct in saying Charlie would have refused to participate? And Mitzel would be the Paul Lind in the center square.
Yeah.
We're on my computer, you are right now.
I'm off to the side on mine.
Excellent. And there have been a few questions about how did Fag Rag actually spread outside of Boston? How did it actually get made? Those sorts of things. But there's a question asking, and Dee mentions, we've experienced a real zine and self-publication renaissance. What advice do you have to young people who are interested in developing these kinds of collective publications?
Be anarchic, be anarchists.
Yeah.
It's more fun and you get more done.
Yeah. Also it is, I have students who actually do like lots of projects, and it always, I mean, it's great, but I just remember, you know, being at a light table with an X-Acto knife, and they can go on their computers and put out an entire 20-page zine without getting out of their chair. You know, I think the thing is to actually not, it's not the format, it's the vision.
Hmm.
What do you want to say, and who do you want to reach, and why? And it doesn't matter whether it's a podcast, it doesn't matter whether it's a zine, it doesn't matter if it's a YouTube channel. But everybody has something to say, and the point is to actually find what that is, and find the audience and expand the audience.
I mean, I certainly, and again, I know next to nothing about publications and publishing, but I could imagine, given the amount of media that we have now, that we had it relatively easy back then. There was not so much competition. And of course, even in the beginning, or maybe not even in just the beginning, there was probably a hunger for some of the stuff, or maybe a lot of the stuff that we were putting out. And so I imagine people who want to self-publish now, they're competing with a lot of other people who are doing the same thing.
And may I just throw in too that the hunger versus oversaturation, which is what today might be.
Yeah.
But you had mentioned some of you mentioned the Boston Gay Review, Gay Poets, and Fag Rag books. These were also offshoots of Fag Rag that you managed to put out. I wanted to mention those in case anybody wanted to just talk on them just a little bit.
Oh, I'll just quickly say that we had printed a series of articles by Arthur Evans called Witchcraft and the Gay Counterculture, which were actually, Arthur was a PhD student who dropped out of school, but still he was writing a dissertation. And they were all over the place, and Charlie and I edited them down to a book form. And we probably, from publication, which was probably early 80s, we probably sold over 20,000 copies of them, mailing them out through mail order, giving them to bookstores, and the book is still in print, although obviously Fag Rag doesn't own it anymore. So I think that there was a lot of literary and theoretical, lack of a better word, movement coming out of Fag Rag that really spread throughout the country.
Michael, you talked earlier about the sort of groundbreaking books that came out of Good Gay Poets, and I think that's a really important part of Fag Rag's history.
Yeah, I mean, we actually published Adrian Sanford's book called Black and Queer, which was the as far as we can determine, the first book by a Black queer man, and a book called 25 Years of Malcontent by Stephanie Bird. Not the first, but an early Black lesbian poetry book. And Maurice Kenny, who was a rather famous at that point Indigenous queer poet. So I think that these weren't exactly Fag Rag material for the magazine, but they certainly were books.
I think John Wieners is, of course, to be mentioned because he was a big part of our lives. Personally, Charlie was with him a lot. And then I guess there was his last book was, what was it, The Capitol?
Beyond the state capitol, behind the state capitol.
Right.
And Michael, I thought you were sort of one of the people who were the catalyst behind Boston Gay Review. How many issues of that were published?
3, maybe 4 spectacular issues, but you know, and that really was very, very literary, that we did actually focus on that. Yeah.
And that was sort of I always thought of it, it's like, well, this is stuff we wouldn't publish in Fag Rag. That's really important that it gets published. And that was how I envisioned, I was like 18 or 19 years old at the time. That was how I saw the need for Boston Gay Review. It's like, this is important stuff, but it doesn't fit in with the Fag Rag format.
Not at all. Not at all. Yeah. Are there more questions, Joan?
But there are lots of questions,
Oh,
but you know, it's
ask away.
the determining the, you know, figuring out when to jump in and out.
Yeah.
So there are a few about distributing gay publications sort of secretly. Sue Katz is in the chat. Hi, Sue. There are 2 issues of Lavender Vision that had to be distributed secretly in many places, like Jacques. They used to pass them to people under the tables, which Sue says, which is how I met one of the loves in my life. Did Fag Rag had to do that in the early years? And then there's another question about kind of radical bookshops in Cambridge. Like, was there a network that copies were being distributed to, or was it more? We keep talking about anarchy. Was it more anarchic?
We hawked a lot of the Fag Rags. So usually in Harvard Square or on the Cambridge Common or the Boston Common, where we had meetings and picnics. And so at least in the beginning, it was just, here it is, have a copy, 10 cents.
Do you remember, Mark, was it carried at, it must have been carried at Red Book if we were meeting at Red Book, right?
Yes, it was.
Yes. Right. And there were there were a bunch of bookstores in Cambridge. There was one called 100 Flowers,
Yep.
which was sort of a I'm not sure radical, but sort of a progressive bookstore. Red Book, of course. But also, right, the main stores in Harvard Square, Reading International, Nini's Corner, Paperback Booksmith, also all carried Fag Rag by probably 75. Grolier Bookstore carried it.
Certainly not in the beginning.
No, not at the beginning, but I think probably by 75.
Yeah, I could never imagine Nini's Corner carrying Fag Rag back in 1970 or 71.
I remember that on the meeting after the newspaper would arrive back from the printer, that would be the night that we stuffed all the envelopes. Mitzel would provide us with all the address labels, and you know, we would you know, be hundreds, maybe 1,000, but at least hundreds of parcels going to the post office that night. And then Mitzel would bundle up packages to bookstores all over the world. You know, on his days off, right after the paper was published, he would be in the back room, you know, 10 copies to this place in Chicago and 15 copies to this place in Philadelphia. And, you know, it really was a labor of love for all of us. We literally were the ones putting it in the envelope and putting them in the bundles and getting them to the post office.
Yeah. A few years ago, I gave a talk at Gaze the Word in London. And Uli, who runs the store, went down to the basement and found the index card that had the Fag Rag address, that they were in correspondence with Fag Rag from probably 78 until 87.
And
their files.
We sent them out free to prisoners too. And
yes.
They actually got through to some prisons, and then other places just absolutely not. But that's how we sort of got the prison correspondence going, that anybody who asked for it, we would send it out free.
Yeah.
And I have a question. I mean, for you latter folk, was there ever a formal editor or editing function at Fag Rag? So, I mean, was there any editing function?
Well,
I mean, you would receive an article.
You mean editing as in correcting punctuation and spelling?
Yeah.
No. We published it as the writer, as the author presented it to us.
And as an dysfunction.
Yeah. As far as an editorial board, it was literally the group of us sitting around the table on Tuesday night talking about it. And if somebody objected strenuously, it was just removed from the conversation. And if somebody was vehement about publishing something, it would pretty much always get in. You know, it was an anarchist collective. You know, we were a group of people, and you know, I may feel one way about something in March of 1978 and feel completely differently about it in February of 1981. You know,
or even April of 78. More questions, Joan?
Yeah, so there are there are a couple of questions about sort of sharing space with gay community news. Somebody and now I can't remember the quote. So they may not have said that Fag Rag squatted in the GCN office occasionally, but so I might be misparaphrasing someone. But you know, somebody asked about the fire at GCN and its effect on Fag Rag, if folks wanted to talk about that.
In July of 1982.
I thought it was earlier than that, but I do remember that it had a huge impact on us. I never thought of us as squatters. I thought we actually paid rent. Maybe we didn't.
We did pay rent.
We did pay rent.
Okay,
right?
then you weren't
Yeah,
squatters, and
we
I'm
weren't
just
squatters.
historically,
We
we talked about me
Right.
making up historical gossip at the
That's
beginning of
okay.
this as a historian.
Well, us
Um,
squatting
I would-
certainly fit in with our reputation. We should have been squatting.
We may have eaten food in the GCN refrigerator without asking, but we didn't squat.
that's just redistributing resources,
Well, we shared our drugs with them too.
which is the polite thing to do. So anyway, yeah, the fire mark 82. Do we have any recollections or thoughts?
Huge. I mean,
Mhm.
I don't remember where our next meeting was. When was the next meeting after the fire? Where did we meet? Did we meet at South Station Cinema for the next meeting? You're
Oh,
muted.
Maya, you're muted.
Maya, you're muted.
Sorry, my dog was barking. I can't actually remember where we went for that after meetings. I remember the discussions. It was a whole summer of fire. I mean, houses in Fort Hill were burning down. There was a whole thing about the disgruntled firemen, policemen setting these fires. They felt like Fag Rag was something different. And because it was connected with the Glad Day books and GCN and Fag Rag, they all lost their homes at the same time.
Yeah.
Charlie said it was a bomb, but I don't know whether
A
that's
firebomb. It
true
was
or
a
not. It was
firebomb.
a firebomb. Okay.
It was arson. It was definitely
Yeah.
arson.
Yeah.
But if I remember correctly, we started meeting at South Station Cinema. Mitzel was the manager of South Station Cinema, and the projection room had a big desk in it, and we would just gather around the desk and have our meetings there. I think we may have even had some meetings in what had been the flower shop at Charlie's house on
I
Broadway in
think so.
Cambridge.
Yeah.
I think we had some meetings in there, but we never really had a home again, as far as I remember. It was all,
Well, I
you
think
know,
there was a place we rented by the time
Yeah.
I left, but I can't remember what or where.
I don't remember either.
Well,
but
we certainly moved into the new GCN office.
Yeah.
And shared it with them for layout and everything. First on Tremont and then on Berkeley.
I remember the Tremont Street space. I don't remember the Berkeley Street.
But I
place.
think materially, we actually lost many issues of Fag Rag. We lost
Everything.
boxes of books
Yeah.
of the John Wiener's books. We lost a lot of the Nancy Ballard books. We lost a lot of the Arthur Evans books.
Yeah.
Somebody, sorry, as I scroll through, we have so many questions in the chat and they're all really excellent. Tyler asked, you know, Fag Rag is quite unique in its longevity as a gay liberation publication, surviving well into the mid to late 80s, when most other gay liberation publications and organizations had folded or became more aligned with the mainstream gay rights movement. What do you attribute to the endurance of this publication? And I think in light of the fire, especially having that kind of setback, you know, how did you continue to move forward?
Well, there were a couple of things going on from my point of view at that time in the gay community. The gay community was becoming very middle class. Gay liberation, for all intents and purposes, was dead. It was now gay rights that people were focusing on. Radicalism was no longer de rigueur, and it was no longer cool. And I think that cultural attitude was very strong at the same time, around the same time that the fire happened. That was then quickly followed, that sort of white bread version of gay liberation and gay rights also led right into the beginning of the AIDS crisis. So, and Fag Rag was very much in a transitional state. And I don't think that an anarchist collective, I don't think we as an anarchist collective were up to the task of competing in the new world, in the new gay world.
I think I remember after the fire too, it seemed like sort of one of the last moments of togetherness there was we had a huge rally at the Arlington Street Church that packed the church. And everybody spoke from from the bookstore, from GCN, from Fag Rag. Someone gave me opium before I went on, so I don't remember what I said, but it seemed like one of the last times that all of these groups were, and then the bookstore became a business and GCN moved this way, and we were, kind of floundering around until 87 in a way.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the paper continued, right, for those 5 years to a huge degree because of Charlie's dedication and Charlie's commitment.
Yeah.
Right.
And his ability to meet new people, and new people came in and they were brought in and they were made welcome and they kept on meeting.
Yeah.
There's a question about, and actually I wanted to acknowledge, there's been several questions about the Fort Hill Faggots for Freedom. So I know that John Kuiper is here. John will have to talk about doing a different oral history live panel about the Fort Hill Faggots for Freedom. But there are a couple of questions about connections between Fag Rag and the women's movement, connections to lesbian in particular, who made up a major part of the feminist groups in Boston. That comes from Rochelle Ruthschild. Hi, Rochelle. And then a question about, oh geez, bad attitude. I've lost track about the question of bad attitude, but that, Fag Rag helped distribute as an insert the first issue of Bad Attitude. And, what was the relationship of Fag Rag to lesbian or women focused publications? Did Fag Rag contribute any discourse to the feminist porn wars? And that comes from RJ History. So basically, tell us about some lesbians, guys.
Right.
All the lesbians I knew were punks,
Yeah.
were in the punk rock scene. I wasn't really involved with lesbian feminism in the political world, and that was part of being raised by a feminist. As a man, I was sort of told that my opinions about feminism weren't really needed. And that doesn't mean that all the lesbians I knew didn't want to hear what I had to say, but my relationship with lesbians in the late 70s and the early 80s was all around rock and roll. It wasn't really around politics. So I don't know what others have to offer.
Well, I think there was a split. And so, I mean, I had lesbian friends, we went around, but the movement was starting to split between women who were really writing things that were sex positive and the separatist movement. So the separatist feminism was very big in Boston, but there were also other people doing alternative things, and those were the people we knew.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in the early years, and I'll speak personally, when quote, the women separated, or the women asserted that they needed to be separate, that was disappointing to me because I wanted to work with women. But I think the context at that point was that we understood, or some of us understood, that the status for women was very different than the status for men, that we had power and privilege that they did not, and that it was important for them to basically not have to be muddled or whatever by our involvement. Their separation, their independence was important. That's the way I understood it.
Yeah, and certainly the Lavender Vision, the two issues of Lavender Vision were men and women together. And then when they separated, Fag Rag was quite clear that they were going to speak only for gay men.
Yeah.
Because we didn't have the right to speak for other people, meaning women.
Yeah.
and Fag Rag was always articulated a very pro-feminist line. We had articles about reproductive rights, often, right? But it was clear that it was just about gay, which is why bringing in, distributing and printing Bad Attitude was so amazing, that we actually sort of in some way the circle came back in a full way.
Excellent. And for those who don't know, Bad Attitude is a lesbian sex magazine that was published, I think, for 2 years. And I think we have a full run in the archives. So please feel free to reach out to us to check out Bad Attitude.
And was that 83 to 85? Was that the era? Am I remembering that correctly? 82 to 84, something like that.
Oh, we looked this up in advance of the panel. I'm gonna ask my question and then I'm gonna do a quick Google to double check the date before I tell you it was definitely this date and that's wrong. But there are several questions about gay liberation, both today, kind of looking at the last 40 years. I think Karen Khan, her question is probably the most distinct of these ones, and it's sort of, what lessons do you see from activism in the 70s and 80s for the moment we found ourselves in today?
For me, that's a very difficult question. I think I can't help but think that what's happening now, it just seems very clear to me. It is being used to divide people. The amount of attention that occurred, in the run-up to the election around transgender persons. Given, their representation, in the population was so clearly an effort to divide people, and how to bring people together. I think that's the challenge that we have to speak to, how terrible and how horrible and whatever, I'm rambling.
I think that one of the things for me, I'm in my 60s now. I have a different kind of lifestyle than I had when I was involved in more active in gay liberation. What's most striking to me is the commercialization. In the 70s, I used to say capitalism abhors a vacuum. Every political movement is turned into a market. And living in New York, I think that's magnified much more. And maybe San Francisco sees it too. But, the New York Gay Pride Parade is now like sponsored by Macy's or by Heineken, or, they have all these big billboards along the parade route. And the notion of that happening between 1974, when I saw my first Gay Pride Parade, and even all the way up into the 90s, into the post-AIDS movement, that was just anathema to the idea of being politically active, being a leftist,
I stopped going to Gay Pride because it was so commercial. So I'm sort of interested in what will happen this year, where some of the commercial people will not participate.
Right.
And maybe that's a good thing.
Maybe it's a blessing in disguise, right?
I get an ironic laugh I found online. I looked up Fag Rag once, and I'm not real computer savvy. And I found that there's another magazine called Fag Rag that's been around for about 3 years.
It's new, yeah.
And it's centered in different art centers, and it's glossy and it's expensive. And and some of the art is kind of wild, but it seems to be like it's almost the antithesis of what Fag Rag used to be.
Yeah, and that's
that name.
Michael, didn't you have some communication with those people?
A little bit, not very much. I have a friend who wrote a book about Fire Island who spoke to them quite a bit, because the first few issues came out were centered at Fire Island, and Fire Island would have been anathema to the original Fag Rag collective.
Yeah,
because it was a commercialized gay resort money pit. as was Provincetown for that matter,
Key West, yeah.
and Key West.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to realize that the organizing skills, the organizing energy that we saw in the gay movement in the early 70s really resurfaced again with ACT UP
Mm-hmm.
the later
Yes.
80s in a way that was totally a sort of rejection of the more mainstream gay rights movement.
Yeah.
And perhaps that'll happen again.
Yeah.
I mean, if the economy collapses and people will radicalize.
Yeah.
You know, that's money
Why would
does
that
that to
happen?
people.
Yeah. Well, day by day, we're seeing what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think it's because Fag Rag sort of didn't make it into the AIDS culture.
No.
It was sort of wrapping up as the AIDS as ACT UP became bigger and bigger, and it's not a value judgment. I think it's just it's about timing. But I think it's really, really important to say that ACT UP really was the grandchild of the original gay liberation. I
Yeah.
mean, there were leftists. It was a radical movement. People were doing and saying things that sounded like 20 years earlier. I think that's a conversation that's not had enough, is how radical ACT UP was and how much it was like the roots of gay liberation.
And I think oh, go ahead.
I actually, because we were coming to the end here, I had a quick question for Mark and Kevin. Could you ever imagine when you were meeting at the house at Prospect Street or on Norfolk, I forget which one it was, in those first two issues, that we actually had computers and that we'd be online on a Zoom call?
No,
No,
absolutely. Absolutely.
Discuss the
not.
historical importance of Fag Rag?
Absolutely.
And also that so many people would have died
Yeah.
connected with Fag Rag.
Yeah. I think, just as a final comment, I guess I can take a certain pride in that I was involved, not just, of course, in Fag Rag, but lots of other things having to do with the LGBT community in general. But that, the Fag Rag was an important impetus for, a lot of stuff that came after. And I think that we all collectively can take pride in that.
And that's Matisse is hopping back on probably to wrap us up. But I just wanted to say again, thank you all so much for doing this, for answering our questions. And yeah, and for being here on Zoom, however many years later. I'm not a math person. And I think in this moment in particular, what we're seeing at the History Project, especially from younger folks, they're looking for stories from people in our community who have paved the way in a lot of ways, and who they can learn from and get inspiration from, and sometimes argue against what you were doing 40 or 50 years ago. But I think it's just so important to talk openly about how you did it and why you did it and what it meant to you. So thank you so much for doing that with us tonight.
Thank you for everything
A
you've done.
pleasure.
yeah, thank
And
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for hosting us, and thank you for the History Project.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump back in at the end here and say once again, thanks to everyone, all the audience who came to this. Thank you for listening. We'll be posting this on YouTube for those who weren't able to make it. Thank you all to the panelists. Your stories were so incredible and wonderful to hear. Thank you, Mark, for facilitating. And yeah, everyone, let's stay in touch, and we can if anyone has more questions, feel free to email us. We can kind of distribute them. We'll see if there's a way to get even more information about all the wonderful things that Fag Rag did. So thank you all for being here, and everyone, I hope you all have a great night.
Thank you.
All right.